rancher slept beside the wife of a warrior at sunrise. The tribe surrounded his cabin with fire. The smoke was already rising when Garrett Whitmore opened his eyes. Not the gentle curl of morning cookfire, but thick black plumes that spoke of deliberate destruction. Through the crack in his cabin shutters, he could see them silent figures positioned in perfect formation around his property, their painted faces catching the first rays of dawn. Each warrior held a burning torch, and their eyes held something far more dangerous than flame. Beside him, Ayanna stirred in her sleep, her dark hair spread across the rough wool blanket like spilled ink. 20 years old, with skin that held the warmth of desert sand and eyes that could stop a man's heart mid-beat. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, the kind of beauty that starts wars and ends lives. And she belonged to another man. Garrett's hand moved instinctively toward the Winchester leaning against the log wall, but he stopped himself. 23 warriors surrounded his cabin. Even if he managed to take down half of them, the other half would ensure he never saw another sunrise. The mathematics of survival weren't in his favor, and mathematics had always been his strong suit. 6 months ago, Garrett had been nothing more than another drifter passing through the Arizona territory, his pockets empty and his prospects even emptier. The cattle ranch he'd inherited from his uncle was little more than a collection of rotting fence posts and broken dreams when he'd arrived. But it was land, 400 acres of scrub brush and possibility, and in 1876, land meant everything. The Chiricahua Apache had been watching him from the beginning. He knew that now. They'd observed as he repaired the barn, as he rounded up the scattered cattle, as he slowly transformed the failing ranch into something resembling prosperity. They'd studied his routines, learned his weaknesses, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had apparently arrived. Ayanna's breathing changed beside him, the rhythm shifting from sleep to wakefulness. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in the amber light filtering through the shutters, then widening as she heard the subtle sounds outside, the creak of leather, the soft shuffle of moccasined feet, the barely audible whispers in her native tongue. She sat up quickly, the blanket falling away from her shoulders, and Garrett saw fear flicker across her features for the first time since he'd known her. Real fear, not the carefully controlled concern she'd shown during their secret meetings over the past 3 months. This was different. This was the look of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. How many? She whispered in English, her accent lending a musical quality to the words despite the circumstances. 23 that I can see, Garrett replied, his voice barely audible. Could be more positioned where I can't spot them. Ayanna closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, the fear had been replaced by something harder. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. She'd always known this moment would come. They both had, from the very first time their eyes had met across the trading post in Tombstone. She'd been there with her husband Nalnish, a war chief whose reputation for ruthlessness extended far beyond the boundaries of Apache territory. Even the cavalry spoke his name with grudging respect and fear. He was 15 years her senior, a man carved from stone and shaped by countless battles, with scars that told stories of survival against impossible odds. Garrett had been loading supplies when he'd first seen her flour, coffee, ammunition, the basic necessities of frontier life. She'd been standing beside a magnificent black stallion, her posture regal despite the simple buckskin dress she wore. Their eyes had met for perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds had contained entire conversations. He'd thought about her for weeks afterward, telling himself it was nothing more than the natural reaction of a lonely man to an exceptionally beautiful woman. The frontier was harsh on everyone, but it was particularly cruel to those who faced it alone. Months could pass without seeing another soul, and when human contact finally came, it hit with the force of a flash flood. But when he'd encountered her again, this time alone at the creek that marked the boundary between his land and traditional Apache territory, He'd realized it was something more than loneliness. She'd been gathering medicinal plants, her movements graceful and purposeful, and when she'd looked up to find him watching her, neither of them had pretended it was an accident. "I should not be here," she'd said in her careful English. "Neither should I," he'd replied, and they'd both known he wasn't talking about the creek. That conversation had led to others. Careful meetings, always brief, always on the border between their two worlds. She taught him things about the land that no white man had ever learned, which plants could heal wounds, how to read the sky for weather changes days in advance, where to find water when the wells ran dry. In return, he'd shared stories of the world beyond the territories, describing cities she'd never seen and ways of life she could barely imagine. She was curious about everything, her mind sharp and hungry for knowledge that her circumstances would never allow her to pursue. The attraction had been inevitable, though neither had acknowledged it directly for the longest time. It simmered beneath their conversations like heat rising from summer stones, unspoken but undeniably present. She was married to a man who controlled her every movement, and Garrett was an outsider whose very presence on Apache land was tolerated only through an uneasy truce. But understanding the impossibility of their situation and accepting it were two entirely different things. The first time he'd kissed her, it had been beside the same creek where they'd first spoken. She'd been explaining the properties of a particular root when he'd reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, and suddenly explanations had become irrelevant. She'd kissed him back with a passion that spoke of years of suppressed desires and dreams deferred. "This will bring only pain," she'd whispered against his lips. "I know," he'd replied, and kissed her again anyway. They'd been meeting in secret for 3 months, stealing moments when her husband was away on hunting trips or raids against Mexican settlements. She would tell Nalnish she was gathering plants or visiting relatives, and Garrett would ride to their meeting place with his heart pounding like a war drum. Last night had been different. Nalnish had left 5 days earlier with a war party heading south toward the Mexican border. Intelligence suggested they wouldn't return for at least a week, possibly longer if they encountered resistance. For the first time since their relationship had begun, they'd had an entire night together. She'd arrived at his cabin just after sunset, her horse loaded with enough supplies to suggest she'd planned to stay. They'd cooked dinner together over his fireplace, shared a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, and talked until the fire burned down to embers. When she'd finally come to his bed, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Not desperate or hurried, as their previous encounters had been, but gentle and deliberate. They'd made love with the patience of people who had all the time in the world, even though they both knew time was their greatest enemy. Afterward, as she lay sleeping in his arms, Garrett had allowed himself to imagine a different life. Maybe they could leave the territory together, head north to Colorado or west to California. She was intelligent enough to adapt to life in a proper town, and he had enough saved to make a fresh start somewhere. It had been a beautiful dream, right up until the moment he'd opened his eyes to find Apache warriors surrounding his cabin. Now, as dawnlight grew stronger and the smoke from their torches began to thicken, that dream felt like something from another lifetime. Reality had arrived with the subtlety of a cavalry charge, and it was demanding payment for 3 months of stolen happiness. "What will they do?" Garrett asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ayanna didn't respond immediately. She was listening to something he couldn't hear, her head tilted slightly as she parsed the low voices outside. Apache communication was complex, layered with meanings that went far beyond simple words, and she was gathering information that might determine whether they lived to see another day. Finally, she turned to face him, and he saw his own death reflected in her dark eyes. "They know," she said simply. "Everything." Garrett felt his stomach drop. How? Someone saw us. Or suspected. It does not matter now. She moved to the window, carefully positioning herself to peer through a gap in the shutters without exposing herself to the warriors outside. My husband returned early from the raid. 3 of his men were killed in an ambush near Nogales. He came looking for me to share the news of their deaths. The implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. In Apache culture, a wife's first duty was to be available when her warrior husband needed her. The fact that Ayanna had been absent during a moment of tribal mourning would have been suspicious enough. But to discover she'd spent the night in the bed of a white rancher. "He's out there?" Garrett asked, though he already knew the answer. Ayanna nodded toward the largest figure visible through the shutters. Even at this distance, Nalnish was unmistakable. He stood a full head taller than the other warriors, his presence commanding attention without effort. War paint covered his face in intricate patterns that told the story of his victories, and his black hair was decorated with eagle feathers earned through acts of extraordinary courage. But it was his stillness that made him truly terrifying. While the other warriors shifted slightly, adjusting their positions or checking their weapons, Nalnish stood like a stone monument to controlled fury. He held no torch, carried no visible weapon, and yet somehow managed to be the most menacing figure in the entire assembly. "He's waiting," Ayanna continued. "According to Apache law, he has the right to kill us both. But he wants us to know we are trapped first. He wants us to understand that there is no escape, no possibility of mercy, only justice." Garrett had heard stories of Apache justice from other ranchers, traders, and cavalry officers. It was swift, absolute, and often creative in its cruelty. Men who violated tribal law didn't simply die, they were made examples of, their suffering serving as a warning to others who might consider similar transgressions. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to Arizona seeking freedom from the constraints of civilized society, tired of rules and expectations that seemed designed to crush a man's spirit. Out here in the territories, he'd thought, a person could live by their own code, make their own choices without answering to anyone. But the frontier had its own laws, older and harsher than anything he'd left behind in Ohio. And now those laws were about to exact their price. "Is there any chance ... double quotes," he began, then stopped. There was no point in asking about escape routes or negotiation. The fact that 23 warriors had taken the time to surround his cabin meant this was a formal execution, not a simple act of vengeance. They would have planned for every possibility, anticipated every move he might make. Ayanna seemed to read his thoughts. "No," she said quietly, "there is no chance." Outside, the sun continued its steady climb above the horizon, and the shadows cast by the warriors began to shorten. Soon, the waiting would be over. But for now, in these final moments before the storm broke, Garrett found himself studying the woman who had changed his life so completely. She was preparing herself for death with a dignity that took his breath away. There was no panic in her movements, no desperate searching for impossible solutions. She'd accepted their fate with the same quiet grace she'd brought to everything else in her life, and somehow that made the entire situation even more tragic. 3 months ago, she'd been a stranger whose beauty had caught his eye across a crowded trading post. Now she was the center of his universe, the first thing he thought about when he woke and the last thing on his mind before sleep. In 90 days, she'd managed to show him what love actually felt like. Not the pale imitation he'd settled for in previous relationships, but the real thing, overwhelming, transformative, and worth dying for. The realization struck him with surprising clarity. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving her to face death alone. "Ayanna," he said, reaching for her hand, "I need you to know something." She turned from the window, her expression patient despite the circumstances. Even now, with execution waiting just outside their door, she was beautiful enough to stop his heart. "These past 3 months," he continued, "they've been the best of my life. I know that probably sounds foolish, given where we are, but it's true. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that loving you has been worth every consequence." For the first time since waking, she smiled. It was small and sad, but genuine. "I know," she said simply. "It has been the same for me." Outside, something changed. The subtle sounds of movement stopped, replaced by a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Even the morning birds seemed to sense the tension, their songs fading until the only sound was the crackle of burning torches. Then Nalnish spoke, his voice carrying easily through the cabin walls despite its measured tone. He was speaking in Apache, but Ayanna translated quietly as he continued. "He says we have dishonored ourselves and our people," she whispered. "He says we chose passion over duty, desire over honor. He says we must pay the price for our choices." Garrett squeezed her hand tighter. "What else? He offers us a choice. We can die together, quickly, or—" She paused, listening to another string of Apache words. When she continued, her voice was barely audible. "Or he will take me back to the village, and you will burn alone." The choice wasn't really a choice at all, and they both knew it. Nalnish was offering Ayanna a chance to live, probably as a slave or outcast, but alive nonetheless. All she had to do was abandon the man she'd risked everything to be with. Garrett found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. He told himself he would understand if she chose to live. She was 20 years old, with decades of life ahead of her if she could find a way to survive her husband's wrath. It would be the practical choice, the smart choice. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he knew what her answer would be. He'd seen it in her eyes the moment she'd realized they were trapped. She'd already made her decision, probably before the sun had finished rising. "Tell him," Ayanna called out in English, loud enough for her husband to hear, "that we choose to die together." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Then Nalnish spoke again, this time in English, his words heavily accented but perfectly clear. "So be it." That was when the first arrow pierced the cabin wall. The projectile struck the timber with a solid thunk, embedding itself deep in the seasoned pine logs. It wasn't aimed to kill not yet. This was a message, a final warning before the real violence began. Garrett could see the obsidian point gleaming in the morning light, its razor edge catching the sun like a promise of death. More arrows followed, creating a deadly pattern around the cabin's perimeter. They weren't random shots but carefully placed warnings, each one marking an escape route that no longer existed. The north wall, where the root cellar entrance lay hidden beneath loose floorboards. The south window, which opened onto a narrow ledge that led to the barn. The back door, which connected to a trail that wound through the scrub oak toward the creek. Every possible exit was now marked with Apache steel, and the message was unmistakable. There would be no running, no hiding, no last-minute reprieve. This was Judgment Day, and the court was already in session. Garrett felt Ayanna's grip tighten on his hand as another arrow struck the shutter inches from where she stood. The impact sent splinters flying, one cutting a thin line across her cheek, but she didn't flinch. Her composure remained unbroken, though he could see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat. "How long do we have?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ayanna tilted her head, listening to the subtle sounds outside. Apache warfare followed ancient rhythms, patterns passed down through generations of conflict. Every movement had meaning, every pause served a purpose. "They are performing the death chant," she said quietly. "It honors the spirits of those about to join the ancestors. When it ends," she didn't need to finish the sentence. When the chanting stopped, so would their lives. The sound began low and rhythmic, barely audible at first but gradually growing stronger. It wasn't the wild war cry that movies and dime novels had taught white audiences to expect. This was something far more solemn, a religious ceremony disguised as an execution. The voices rose and fell in perfect harmony, creating a haunting melody that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. Garrett had heard Apache singing before, during the few peaceful encounters he'd had with hunting parties passing through his land. But this was different. Where those earlier songs had celebrated life and the hunt, This one spoke of endings, of journeys to places where the living could not follow. "Tell me about your husband," Garrett said suddenly. The request surprised him as much as it did her, but he found himself genuinely curious. For 3 months, Nalnish had been an abstract threat, a shadowy figure whose existence made their love impossible. Now, with death approaching, Garrett wanted to understand the man whose wife he'd stolen. Ayanna's expression grew complex, mixing respect and fear with something that might have been affection. "He is not cruel by nature," she said slowly, "but he is a product of his time and his people. When he was young, the Apache roamed freely from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande. Now we are confined to reservations, our children forbidden to speak their native language, our young men dying in cavalry prisons." She moved to another window, peering out at the warrior who had dominated her life for the past 4 years. Even from this distance, Nalnish's presence was commanding. He stood at the center of the formation, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting with the patience of carved stone. "He married me to forge an alliance with my father's band," Ayanna continued. "I was 16, old enough to bear children, but young enough to be molded into the wife he needed. He was never unkind, but kindness and love are different things. He treated me as a valuable possession, something to be protected and displayed, but never truly known." Garrett felt a stab of something that wasn't quite jealousy, but wasn't sympathy either. "Did you ever love him?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, the death chant continued its measured progression, marking time until their execution with mathematical precision. "I respected him," Ayanna said finally. "I was grateful for his protection, proud of his reputation. But love?" She shook her head slowly. "I did not know what love felt like until I met you." The admission hit Garrett harder than he'd expected. He'd always known their relationship was dangerous, but hearing it stated so plainly made the tragedy of their situation feel overwhelming. They'd found something precious and real in a world that had no place for it, and now that world was about to reclaim them both. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it?" Ayanna turned from the window to face him directly. Her dark eyes held no trace of doubt or recrimination, only a quiet certainty that took his breath away. "Never," she said firmly. "I have lived more in these 3 months than in all the years before them combined. If this is the price of real love, then I pay it gladly." Another volley of arrows struck the cabin, these aimed higher than before. They were targeting the roof now, seeking to damage the structure rather than simply intimidate its occupants. Garrett could hear the scrape of metal on wood as the points bit deep into the support beams. The tactical implications were clear. The warriors weren't planning to storm the cabin directly, too much risk of casualties and close-quarters fighting. Instead, they would weaken the structure until it became untenable, forcing their quarry out into the open where superior numbers could overwhelm any resistance. It was a sound strategy, one that demonstrated the same tactical brilliance that had allowed Apache bands to hold off the United States Army for decades despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned. They fought smarter, not harder, using terrain and patience as weapons more effective than bullets. Garrett found himself admiring their professionalism even as they prepared to kill him. There was something almost comforting about facing death at the hands of such competent adversaries. If he had to die, at least it would be to warriors who understood the weight of what they were doing. The sound of splintering wood drew his attention to the roof. One of the arrows had found a weak point where 2 beams joined, and the impact had opened a small gap that let in a shaft of golden morning light. It fell across Ayanna's face like a benediction, highlighting the aristocratic lines of her cheekbones and the full curve of her lips. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, but more than that, she was the most complete person he'd ever known. Intelligent without being cold, passionate without being reckless, strong without being hard. In another time and place, she might have been a teacher or a doctor, someone who changed the world through knowledge and compassion rather than bearing children for political alliances. But the frontier had its own rules about what women could and couldn't be, and those rules were even harsher for Apache women caught between two cultures. Ayanna had been born into a world that was disappearing, raised to fulfill roles that were becoming obsolete, and married to a man who saw her value only in terms of tribal politics. Meeting Garrett had given her a glimpse of possibilities she'd never been allowed to consider. Not just love, but partnership. Not just survival, but growth. Not just duty, but choice. And now those possibilities were about to be extinguished along with their lives. "I want you to know something," Garrett said, moving closer to her as another arrow struck the cabin. "Before I came here, I was half dead inside. I went through the motions of living, but I never felt truly alive. You changed that. You made me remember what it means to be human." Ayanna reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite gentleness. "You gave me my first taste of freedom," she replied. "Even if it was only for 3 months, I was free to choose my own path, to love who I wanted to love. That is worth any price." The death chant outside grew louder, more insistent. Garrett could pick out individual voices now, each warrior adding his own thread to the complex musical tapestry. It was beautiful in its way, a final gift of dignity before the killing began. He wondered if Nalnish was singing too, or if the betrayed husband stood apart from the ceremony, consumed by personal anger rather than ritual duty. Garrett imagined he could feel the warrior's eyes boring into the cabin walls, seeking the man who had stolen his wife's heart and destroyed his honor. "What happens after?" Garrett asked suddenly. "I mean, in Apache beliefs, what comes next?" Ayanna considered the question seriously. Death wasn't something her people feared in the same way as whites. It was a transition, not an ending, a journey to rejoin the ancestors who had walked the same path before them. "We go to the place where the spirits gather," she said. "There, we are reunited with those we have lost, and we wait for those we leave behind to join us. Time moves differently there. What seems like forever to the living passes like a single day for the dead. Will we be together there?" The question came out more vulnerable than he'd intended, revealing fears he hadn't even acknowledged to himself. "I do not know," she admitted. "Apache law and white law may not apply in the spirit world. Perhaps there we will simply be two souls who found each other across the divide between worlds." The possibility offered unexpected comfort. If they were about to die for their love, at least there was hope they might continue it in whatever came after. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to as the walls literally closed in around them. More arrows struck the roof, and this time Garrett heard the crack of breaking timber. The warriors were methodically weakening the structure's integrity, turning their shelter into a trap. Soon, they would have no choice but to emerge into the killing ground outside. "Should we try to fight?" he asked, though they both knew it was futile. His Winchester held 15 rounds, and he had perhaps 30 additional cartridges in his gun belt. Against 23 warriors armed with bows, rifles, and intimate knowledge of the terrain, their chances of survival were non-existent. "We could," Ayanna said thoughtfully. "My husband would respect us more if we died fighting, but we would die just the same." Garrett nodded, understanding. The Apache respected courage, but they weren't sentimental about hopeless gestures. A fighting death might earn them a measure of honor, but it wouldn't change the outcome or reduce the suffering of their final moments. "Then we face it together," he said simply. The death chant reached its crescendo, voices rising in harmonies that seemed to make the very earth tremble. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of burning torches and the soft whisper of wind through the scrub oak. In that silence, Garrett heard the sound he'd been dreading, footsteps approaching the cabin. Not running or charging, but walking with the measured pace of men who knew their quarry had nowhere to go. The hunt was over, and it was time to collect the prize. "They're coming," Ayanna whispered unnecessarily. Garrett pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, memorizing the scent of her hair and the way she fit perfectly in his arms. If these were to be their final moments together, he wanted to remember every detail. "I love you," he said against her ear. "I love you too," she replied, and somehow that made everything else bearable. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Nalnish's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Garrett Whitmore," he said in careful English, "you will come out now, or we will come in." It wasn't a negotiation or a threat. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who held all the cards. The game was over, and it was time to settle accounts. Garrett looked into Ayanna's eyes one last time, seeing his own reflection there along with all the love and loss that had brought them to this moment. Then, together they walked toward the door, and whatever waited beyond, the door swung open on rusted hinges, and Arizona morning light flooded the cabin like water through a broken dam. Garrett squinted against the brightness, his eyes taking precious seconds to adjust after the dim interior. When his vision cleared, the sight that greeted him was both magnificent and terrifying. 23 Apache warriors stood in perfect formation around his property, their painted faces turned toward him with expressions of stone. Each man held his weapon ready but not raised a show of discipline that spoke to years of military precision. These weren't raiders or bandits driven by greed or bloodlust. They were soldiers carrying out a sentence handed down by their own system of justice. At the center of the formation stood Nalnish, and seeing him up close for the first time, Garrett understood why this man commanded such absolute respect. He was built like a force of nature, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that dominated any space he occupied. His war paint was more elaborate than the others, intricate patterns that told stories of victories stretching back decades. But it was his eyes that truly intimidated. They held the cold focus of a man who had killed many times and would kill again without hesitation. Yet beneath that coldness, Garrett glimpsed something else: pain. The kind of deep, personal agony that came from betrayal by someone you trusted completely. This wasn't just about tribal law or Apache justice. This was personal. Ayanna stepped out beside Garrett, her chin raised defiantly despite the circumstances. The morning sun caught in her dark hair, creating highlights that made her look like some ancient goddess stepping down from the mountains. Even facing death, she moved with the same grace that had first caught his attention months ago. The reaction among the warriors was immediate and complex. Garrett saw respect in some faces, disappointment in others. A few looked away entirely, unable to meet her eyes. She had been one of their own, a daughter of the tribe, and her betrayal cut deeper than any enemy's blade. Nalnish studied his wife for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, it was in Apache, the words flowing like water over stone. Ayanna listened without interrupting, her posture growing more rigid with each syllable. "What is he saying?" Garrett asked quietly. "He is recounting my crimes," she replied without taking her eyes off her husband. "Adultery, betrayal of marriage vows, dishonor to the tribe, consorting with enemies." She paused as Nalnish continued speaking. "He says I have forgotten who I am, forgotten the blood that flows in my veins." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. In Apache culture, identity was everything, not just individual identity, but connection to family, tribe, and the ancient ways that had sustained their people for countless generations. To forget who you were was to cease existing in any meaningful sense. Nalnish switched to English, his words carefully pronounced despite his heavy accent. 4 years I protected you. 4 years I provided for you, honored you as my wife. I asked nothing except loyalty." His voice grew harder. "You have given that loyalty to our enemy instead." Ayanna straightened her shoulders, meeting her husband's gaze directly. "I gave you 4 years of obedience," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. But I could not give you my heart. That was never yours to command. The words hit Nalnish like physical blows. Garrett saw the warrior's jaw clench, his hands tightening into fists. Around the circle, other warriors shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer just about justice. It was becoming something messier, more human. Your heart? Nalnish's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. I am war chief of the Chiricahua. My victories are legend among our enemies. My name is spoken with fear from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande. And you give your heart to a white rancher who owns 400 acres of dust? The contempt in his voice was absolute, but Garrett heard something else underneath it. Confusion. Genuine bewilderment at how his wife could choose a nobody over a legend. It was the kind of wounded pride that turned dangerous men into something far worse. Love does not measure worth by reputation or land, Ayanna said quietly. It chooses where it will, regardless of wisdom or consequences. Love, Nalnish repeated the word like it tasted bitter. This is what white men call it when they steal what belongs to others. The insult was carefully crafted to provoke a response, and Garrett felt anger flare in his chest. But before he could speak, Ayanna stepped slightly forward, placing herself between the two men. Do not blame him for my choices, she said firmly. I came to him freely. I shared his bed willingly. If there is punishment to be given, let it fall on me alone. The offer sparked immediate protest from several warriors. Garrett couldn't understand their rapid Apache, but the tone was clear. They were arguing about something fundamental. Some seemed to support Ayanna's request, while others appeared outraged by it. Nalnish silenced them with a single raised hand. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Apache law is clear, he said, still in English. When a wife betrays her husband with another man, both must die. There is no exception for noble intentions or romantic feelings. There is only justice. Garrett had expected this outcome, but hearing it stated so plainly still sent ice through his veins. He looked around at the circle of warriors, searching for any sign of mercy or hesitation. He found none. These men had ridden miles through dangerous territory to carry out this execution. They wouldn't be swayed by appeals to compassion. How will it be done? He asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Nalnish's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps surprised by the direct question. You wish to know the manner of your death? I think we've earned that much, Garrett replied. The war chief considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. You will be given weapons. Knives, not guns. You will fight until one of you can fight no more. The survivor will then face me. His gaze shifted to Ayanna. She will watch, so she understands the cost of her choices. The trial by combat wasn't what Garrett had expected, but it made sense from a cultural perspective. The Apache respected strength and courage above all else. A death in honorable combat was preferable to simple execution, even for those who had violated tribal law. But the mathematics were still impossible. Nalnish was a professional warrior with decades of experience. Garrett was a rancher who'd learned to handle a gun out of necessity, not a trained fighter. The outcome was predetermined, but at least he'd have a chance to die with dignity. And after you kill me? Garrett asked. Nalnish's expression grew even colder. My wife returns to the village. She will live, but as an outcast. No warrior will speak her name. No woman will acknowledge her presence. She will exist but not belong, a reminder to others of the price of betrayal. It was a fate worse than death in many ways, Garrett realized. For a people as tightly knit as the Apache, social exile was the cruelest punishment imaginable. Ayanna would survive physically, but everything that made her who she was would be stripped away. No, Ayanna said suddenly, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. I refuse. The words created instant tension among the warriors. Several reached for their weapons, thinking she might be planning some desperate escape attempt. But Ayanna stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, showing no intention of fleeing. You refuse what? Nalnish asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I refuse to watch, she said clearly. I refuse to live as an outcast. I refuse to accept your mercy. She took a step forward, moving closer to her husband. If Garrett must die for loving me, then I die with him. Apache law or no Apache law. The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled warriors. Garrett could see them exchanging glances, uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. Apache law was absolute, but it had never anticipated a scenario where the guilty party rejected the prescribed punishment. Nalnish stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. For just a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing something that might have been admiration mixed with profound sadness. You would choose death over life? He asked quietly. I would choose love over existence, Ayanna replied without hesitation. The answer seemed to shake Nalnish more than anything else that had happened. He turned away from her, walking several paces toward the eastern horizon where the sun continued its relentless climb. When he turned back, his expression had hardened into something beyond mere anger. So be it, he said finally. You will both face me in combat, together, if that is your wish. But know this, I will show no mercy because of what we once shared. You are no longer my wife. You are simply another enemy to be destroyed. The formal dissolution of their marriage carried ritual weight that Garrett could feel even without understanding the cultural implications. Around the circle, warriors began a low chant that sounded different from the death song they'd performed earlier. This was something else, perhaps a ceremony of separation or exile. One of the younger warriors stepped forward, carrying 2 knives on a piece of tanned hide. The blades were beautiful in their simplicity, hand-forged steel with leather-wrapped handles, designed for close combat rather than ceremony. They were tools for killing, nothing more and nothing less. Garrett accepted his weapon, testing its weight and balance. It was heavier than he'd expected, with a slight curve to the blade that suggested Apache craftsmanship. The edge looked sharp enough to split hairs, maintained with the care that warriors gave to instruments their lives depended on. Ayanna took her knife with the same calm acceptance she'd shown throughout the morning. Garrett watched her fingers curl around the handle with practiced ease, and he realized this might not be her first time holding such a weapon. Apache women were taught to defend themselves and their families when necessary. Do you know how to use that? He asked quietly. My father taught me when I was 12, she replied. He said a woman who could not protect herself was a burden to her people. The information was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant she might actually contribute to their defense. Disturbing because it highlighted yet again how little he really knew about the woman he'd fallen in love with. Nalnish drew his own blade larger than theirs, with intricate patterns etched into the steel. It was clearly a weapon of significance, probably carried through dozens of battles and blessed by tribal shamans. In his hands, it looked like a natural extension of his body. You may begin when ready, he said, settling into a combat stance that spoke of years of training. Garrett looked at Ayanna, seeing his own fear reflected in her dark eyes. They were about to fight for their lives against impossible odds, but at least they would face death together. It wasn't the life they dreamed of, but it was something. Stay close to me, he whispered. Always, she whispered back. They moved toward Nalnish together, their knives held ready. The war chief waited with the patience of carved stone, his eyes tracking their approach with predatory focus. Around the circle, the other warriors maintained their positions, ready to prevent any escape attempt, but content to let their leader handle the actual killing. The first exchange came faster than Garrett had expected. Nalnish moved like striking lightning, his blade seeking Garrett's throat in a single fluid motion. Only instinct saved him, years of frontier living having sharpened his reflexes to the point where he could react without conscious thought. He threw himself backward, feeling the war chief's knife whistle past his jugular with inches to spare. Before he could recover his balance, Ayanna was there, her own blade flashing toward Nalnish's exposed ribs. The war chief twisted away from her attack with contemptuous ease, bringing his knife around in a backhand slash. That would have opened her throat if she hadn't dropped into a crouch at the last second. His blade cut through empty air where her head had been a moment before. Garrett used the distraction to launch his own attack, driving his knife toward Nalnish's kidney. But the war chief seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. He spun away from Garrett's thrust while simultaneously bringing his elbow up in a devastating strike that caught Garrett in the solar plexus. The breath exploded from Garrett's lungs, and he staggered backward, gasping. Nalnish could have finished him then, but instead he stepped back, allowing both opponents to recover. It was a gesture of contempt. He was so confident in his superior skill that he could afford to give them multiple chances. "Is this the best you can do?" Nalnish asked, his voice carrying clearly across the combat area. "Is this the man worth dying for?" The taunt was directed at Ayanna, but Garrett felt it like a physical blow. He was being humiliated in front of the woman he loved, made to look weak and incompetent. The rational part of his mind knew that was exactly what Nalnish intended, to break his spirit before breaking his body. But rationality had never been Garrett's strongest quality, especially where his pride was concerned. He launched himself forward in a wild charge, abandoning technique in favor of pure aggression. His blade swept toward Nalnish's midsection in a clumsy but powerful swing that would have disemboweled a slower opponent. Nalnish wasn't slower. He sidestepped the attack with minimal effort, then grabbed Garrett's wrist and used his own momentum against him. Garrett found himself flying through the air, his knife spinning away from nerveless fingers as he crashed into the hard-packed earth. Before he could rise, Nalnish was on him. The war chief's knee pressed into Garrett's chest, pinning him to the ground, while the point of his knife came to rest against Garrett's throat. One quick thrust would end everything. But instead of killing him, Nalnish looked up at Ayanna, who stood frozen several feet away. "Your lover dies now," he said calmly, "unless you beg for his life." The offer hung in the air like poison. Garrett could see the terrible choice playing out across Ayanna's features. She could save him by humiliating herself, by admitting their love had been a mistake and pleading for mercy she didn't deserve. "Do it," Garrett gasped, the knife point pricking his skin. "Please." But Ayanna shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I will not dishonor what we shared," she said quietly. "Not even to save your life." Nalnish studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of weakness or doubt. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then you both die with dignity," he said, and raised his knife for the killing stroke. That was when the first gunshot rang out across the desert, followed immediately by a dozen more. The morning air filled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the wild yells of charging cavalry. The United States Army had arrived, and everything changed in an instant. The Apache warriors reacted with the lightning reflexes of men who had spent their entire lives fighting for survival. In seconds, the ordered circle dissolved into chaos as warriors dove for cover behind rocks, trees, and the scattered outbuildings of Garrett's ranch. Their discipline never faltered. Even caught by surprise, they moved with coordinated precision that spoke to years of experience fighting cavalry units. Nalnish rolled away from Garrett as bullets began whistling overhead, his knife forgotten as he drew the Winchester rifle slung across his back. The war chief's face showed no panic, only the cold calculation of a professional soldier adapting to changing circumstances. "How many?" He barked in Apache to the nearest warrior. The answer came back immediately. 30 riders, maybe more. Blue coats, coming from the South Ridge. Garrett scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling from the sudden reversal of fortune. Minutes ago, he'd been facing certain death. Now he was in the middle of a pitched battle between two forces that had been killing each other for decades. Ayanna appeared at his side, still clutching her knife. Her face was pale but determined, and he could see her calculating their chances of survival in this new scenario. "Can we reach the cabin?" she asked urgently. Garrett looked toward his home, now 50 yards away across open ground swept by crossfire. Apache warriors were using his own property for cover, turning his barn and outbuildings into defensive positions. The cabin itself had become a strategic objective. Whoever controlled it would dominate the surrounding area. "Not alive," he replied grimly. The cavalry charge swept into the ranch yard like a blue tornado, sabers flashing in the morning sun and carbines crackling with deadly efficiency. But these weren't raw recruits or weekend warriors. Garrett recognized the guidance snapping in the wind. It belonged to Captain Marcus Bradley's company, veterans of the Apache campaigns who'd been hunting Nalnish's band for months. Bradley himself rode at the head of the charge, his uniform immaculate despite the dust and chaos of combat. He was a man who took personal pride in his appearance and his unit's performance, the kind of officer who treated warfare like a gentleman's sport with rules that must be observed at all costs. The Apache response was immediate and devastating. These weren't reservation Indians armed with antiquated weapons. They were elite warriors, carrying modern rifles taken from previous cavalry defeats. Their return fire was disciplined and accurate, emptying several saddles in the first volley. A trooper screamed as his horse went down, pinning him beneath its thrashing body. Another clutched his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers, his carbine dropping from nerveless hands. The cavalry's momentum broke as riders sought whatever cover they could find in the suddenly deadly terrain. "Take the cabin," Bradley shouted over the gunfire. "Secure those civilians." A squad of troopers peeled off from the main force, spurring their horses toward Garrett and Ayanna. But the Apache had anticipated this move. Warriors who'd been positioned around the property's perimeter now had clear shots at the approaching cavalry. The lead trooper made it halfway across the yard before a rifle bullet took him in the chest, spinning him from his saddle like a child's toy. His horse continued its charge, riderless and panicking, while its former rider lay motionless in the dirt. Garrett grabbed Ayanna's hand, pulling her toward the dubious shelter of his woodpile. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than standing in the open while two armies tried to kill each other around them. They dove behind the stacked logs just as another volley erupted from both sides. Splinters exploded from the wood above their heads, showering them with debris. Garrett could hear bullets whining overhead like angry hornets, searching for flesh to tear. "This is insane," Ayanna gasped, pressed against his side. "They're going to kill us all." She was probably right. Caught between two forces, neither of which particularly cared about their survival, their chances were minimal at best. The cavalry saw them as civilians to be rescued, but wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice them if military necessity demanded it. The Apache saw them as traitors who deserved death, regardless of who delivered it. A new sound cut through the gunfire war cries in Apache, wild and primal. Nalnish's warriors were launching a counterattack, using the terrain they knew intimately to outflank the cavalry positions. They moved like ghosts through the scrub oak and rocky outcroppings, appearing and disappearing so quickly that the soldiers couldn't get clear shots.